I've got a great job because I get to live every student's dream, which is having sat there in Professor Vogel's class, I now get to reverse the roles and be the questioner. So it's a wonderful job being president of the committee. You know, you've got Professor Vogel's bio, and obviously it's an extraordinary, illustrious bio, but it really doesn't tell the whole story, or nearly. It doesn't tell the part, kind of, for people like me. I guess in life we all have a few people who would be, I would say, they're but-fors. But for this person, I am not who I am today. And I think it's fair to say that but for Ezra Vogel, I am not who I am today. I mean, if he was not my professor in college and gave me the advice that he gave me, I would not have had the career that I had. So I am forever in his debt, and as are so many hundreds of other people in the China field today, that it's extraordinary the interest that Ezra has taken and the way he's mentored so many people in the next generation, and now the next generation of China scholars, that you can say the field is populated with people who've studied with Ezra. This book it's wonderful. When I first saw it, I said, gosh, this has got to be too long.
It is.
But it's not. It's really not. And it picks up speed, and it's kind of like a stroll through the last 70 years of Chinese history. And you start in France, where Deng Xiaoping was a student, and you go to the formation of the Chinese Communist Party, and you're in World War II, and then you're in liberation and the Great Leap Forward, and the Cultural Revolution, and Tiananmen, and then Deng's Southern Trip. And the revelations in it are really extraordinary. That is, I know a little bit about the subject, but I have to say, having read the book, I now know a lot more of it. So I would say it is a must-read for those in the field. It is a must-read. So let me, without taking up the whole time praising Ezra, turn it over to him to speak for a little less than a half hour. And then I'll ask him some questions, and then you'll ask him some questions. But let's welcome Ezra Vogel.
It's such a great pleasure to have this opportunity to be with the National Committee, which has really kept the relations among the broad public of the United States into China, and to all the people who have made it great. I'm reminded a little bit of the story of the guy who kept talking about the Johnstown flood, and somebody says, he asked people, can he give a speech tonight? They said, yeah, just remember that Noah's in the audience. So with Mike Blumenthal here, I perhaps should be more reserved than I will be. Steve asked me to keep it under half an hour, and as you know, Harvard faculty is programmed for 50 minutes. And I will try my best. And what I'm going to concentrate on tonight is Deng and foreign policy, and try to give a sense of how he was different from Mao. And I think very critical is the fact that he started, and I'll try to trace him through some of his experiences in foreign policy and what shaped his career. Of course, it's only a few highlights. People ask me, did I learn anything that surprised me during the course of the 10 years I was working on the book? And one thing that surprised me is that he wasn't the only guy that started reform and opening. Vogel Fung had actually started before him. But another thing that surprised me was just how much Deng did know about foreign affairs and how many people he saw during the course of his career. As Li Wan Yu told me when I asked him about it, he had experiences of seeing how imperialist countries developed, how they handled World War II, how they started the Cold War, and had a broad experience. And he also had so many close contact with so many foreign leaders. And while the reporters who attended the June 4th Tiananmen demonstrations in 1989 feel that Deng was a villainous person and did horrible things, as all of us do, I think there are many foreign leaders who met him who were quite impressed by his intelligence and his ability. When he was 15, he passed exams to go to France. And here he is. He doesn't look like somebody who just came in off the street from the poor peasant or working class. Here he is after he arrived in France at age 16. That's the first picture we have of Deng. And he was in France for 5 years, and then he was in the Soviet Union for a year. In 1924, they had the European Chinese Communist Youth Congress that gathered together. And Chen Yi had already been sent home, but there were many others who later played a prominent part in communist life. Zhou Enlai, who was over 6 years older than Deng, had a lot more experience. He was the natural leader of this group. At the left, your left, looking at this picture, you see Nie Rongzhen, who played a role in science, Li Fuchun, who played a key role in the first 5-year plan, and the back row, some people say he was 5 feet tall. Others say he was really only 4 feet 11. It's Deng Xiaoping. I think what's interesting is that these people who had been in France, and that was the largest single group of Chinese students overseas in any single country after World War I, when they needed people who knew about foreign relations, the economy, science and technology, and what it was like to have a modern country, they were the ones. If you look at them, they don't look like people who were poor peasants or people who had been slaving in factories. They had passed examinations, and in order to pass the examinations, they had to come from good families to get good education. And when they went to France, the idea was that they would work half-time and they would save money and study half-time. But when they got there, this plan was worked out in World War I before French men who survived the war returned to the factories. So when they got back to the factories, by the time Deng arrived in 1920, there weren't that many jobs there. And there was also inflation and depression in 1920 in the early 20s in France. And so the people who made money lived in those nice houses that Deng and his friends saw, were living very comfortable life. But if you looked at what was happening on factory floor, the Frenchmen had very poor salaries, didn't make much money, and the foreigners were treated even more poorly, and they had trouble finding the dirtiest jobs that most Frenchmen did not want. And so they started study groups. And when they started the study groups of the Chinese students in France who wanted to rebuild China, they read about what had happened just several years earlier, in 1917, in the Soviet Union, and the idea that capitalists exploit laborers and that imperialist countries exploit others made a lot of sense to them, and a lot of them joined the communist movement at a time when there were very few communists. At the time when Deng joined the Communist Party, there were less than 1,000 members worldwide. We're skipping way up until the 1950s. When Deng moved from the Southwest, where he had been in charge, the party secretary in charge of the Southwest Bureau from 49 to 52 to Beijing, he moved into government and then party affairs. And at that time, as general secretary of the party for over a decade, he had the chance to meet members of communist parties elsewhere. He didn't, during this period, meet foreigners from the West, but he did already have a responsible position. And if you think of it in American terms, it was like somebody who went to work in the White House in his early 20s, and then stayed close to the leaders of power. He had, as you can see in that earlier picture, he was close to Zhou Enlai, and now he was close to Mao. And here he is in the Soviet Union in 1957 when Mao makes a speech about the east wind winning out over the west wind. Here he is with Khrushchev. And in 1956, Deng was also in Moscow and met Khrushchev. And while he was there meeting Khrushchev the first time, Khrushchev made the famous speech denouncing Stalin, and Deng concluded at that time that it was such an overwhelming criticism of Stalin that all the people who had worked in the party, and that was all the important people who had worked with and all important people that had worked with Stalin, that the authority of the party was very badly damaged, and that China should never denounce their first leader, no matter what he did, in the same way. He met a lot of other communist leaders, and here he is with Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh was in France at the same time that Deng was in the early 1920s, but they really didn't get friendly until the Yan'an period, where they saw each other. But here was a time when they were fellow revolutionaries and fighting imperialism together before their national interests really began to diverge shortly after Ho Chi Minh's death. Now, if you look at Deng Xiaoping, he doesn't seem to have an inferiority complex from being short. Here he is at the Beijing airport on the way to Moscow in 1963. He had been in charge of writing the 9 nasty letters exchanged with the Soviet Union, and he was on his way to argue with Suslov in 1963, and Mao was just tickled with the way that Deng fought off Suslov in these quarrels, and was ready to give Deng all kinds of high positions. Then we fast forward again. In 1966, Mao purged Deng in the Cultural Revolution for being too independent and for not following his way. I think the key issue was that about 1959, when Deng felt that they should be doing more to reverse the policies of the Great Leap Forward, which had failed, Deng was disappointed that Mao was pushing ahead, which Deng thought devastated the country. And Mao said at the time, during that period, "Why is it that Deng always sits in the back row and doesn't seem to listen to me?" Deng knew that if he was close and Mao said something, he would follow. But if you could keep a little distance, it would be okay. I think one of the key facts about Deng is that from 69 to 73, he was down in Jiangxi, where he had time to meditate and think about what he would do. One of my colleagues at Harvard, David Gergen, reminded me when I was talking to him about Deng's leadership that Abraham Lincoln and de Gaulle and Churchill had all had high positions. Then they were sent for several years in the wilderness, and then came back and had a much clearer picture about what they wanted to do. And even though Deng wanted to grope for stones when he crossed the river and had a lot of specific things that couldn't be decided, I think the general direction he was thinking through by that time already that he needed some big changes. And I think the fact that he had so much foreign experience very much influenced the way he would say. This, to me, is a very poignant picture because Zhou Enlai, who had done so much in leading foreign policy, was being criticized by Mao in '73 and then got cancer. And when China, mainland China, took the Chinese seat in the UN in 1971, replacing Taiwan, it would be logical that Zhou Enlai had so much experience that he deserved to be the big spokesman at the UN. But here he is at the airport, passing on the mantle to Deng. He had cancer and was under suspicion that he wouldn't be tough enough, and that Deng would be tough on the Soviet Union when he went to the United Nations. And so here he is passing the mantle to Deng. Here's Deng presenting in 74 in the United Nations. And at the United Nations, he had long talks with people from the Third World and was already seen as a leader among the Third World. Here he is up close at the United Nations. And here he is in May 1974 while he was in New York meeting our favorite diplomat, Henry Kissinger. This is the first time that Kissinger met Deng, because in the earlier periods when Nixon went and when Kissinger did his missions with Zhou Enlai, Deng was still down in the countryside. That's, of course, Chow Wan-hwa on your left as you're looking at the foreign minister. And Kissinger thought at the time that Deng seemed to be on a training mission. He didn't seem as suave and as smooth as Zhou Enlai had. But I think also Deng, who had just been reinstated, knew how mercurial Mao was and wanted to be very careful in dealing with Mao, and didn't want to make any errors and was very cautious, unlike the confidence he showed later on. End of Deng then from 73, 74, 75, after he came back, and we saw him in that picture after he came back in 73, meeting Sihanouk. He saw most of the foreign Western leaders. He was already taking Zhou Enlai's place. So for over 2 years, he was the key person that foreigners met. And there's no question that he knew a lot about foreign affairs, and he could give a 30-minute presentation on the history of relations with the Soviet Union or Vietnam or all kinds of issues by the time he was coming to power. After being thrown out by Mao the second time at the end of 75, Deng was out, and then Mao died, of course, in September 76. And Deng was allowed to come back at the beginning of 77 with Hua Guofeng as the chairman and the premier. When Deng came back, he volunteered to take part in education forum. And at that time, in 1977, he felt that he did not want to challenge Hua Guofeng politically, and he felt that education, science, and technology would be more important when they started modernization in a serious way, and that they wanted to get started. So at this session, he asked the education minister and others if they could start having exams that fall and get ready in December or some month that year to reopen the universities in a big way. Under Mao making revolution, when workers and peasants were given favorites, there was no way to have all-out meritocracy under exams, but because the workers and peasants would often not do as well as some of the bourgeois and the farm owners and the kids of those landlords. And so Deng asked if they could possibly get started with real serious entrance examinations, and they gave all the difficulties of 7 million people would be taking and how they organized, let them know what subjects they would be quizzed in, how much, and so forth. And the answer came back that it would be very, very difficult, but it would be possible. And Deng said, we're going to do it. We'll have entrance examinations, and therefore all the people who passed exams that year and entered the universities in the next several years are generally quite grateful to Deng for reopening that. Deng felt that science technology was the key to modernization, and one of the quick ways of getting a head start in science was to get advice from the best scientists of Chinese ancestry in the United States. At that time, there were 3 people of Chinese ancestry in the United States who had Nobel Prizes. They could talk in Chinese, they knew modern science, and they also knew the situation in China. So he had several visits with Yang Zhenning, one of the 3. Sam Ting of MIT was another, and Li Zhongdao and his partner Li Yunze were the 3rd pair. And he saw them all, and the question always was, what can we do to get science into China from the outside? Here he is meeting another Chinese intellectual, the famous linguist I show this partly because that young woman to your right in that picture is Iris Bien, who was my first Chinese language teacher in 1960, and it was one tough cookie. I think one thing that hasn't got enough attention is that though Deng himself had traveled abroad at the United Nations in '74 and been a state guest in France in 1975 and really had a sense of what was going on in the outside world, many other leaders didn't. And there were a lot of delegations that were allowed to go abroad in 1978, but the one that had the greatest single influence was Gumu, and the delegation of high-level leaders who went to Europe. When they came back to China, they were supposed to go for an hour or two meeting in the afternoon. They went for 9 hours. And what they found was that China was much further behind than they thought, that the Europeans were ready to lend them money and let them into their factories. They were surprised, considering so many factories you couldn't even get into in China, that they opened the factories to them, and they were ready to share their technology and investment. So that was a big turning point that helped shape and here's Deng talking to Gumu, helped shape the mood that made them ready, not just Deng personally. Of course, one person could lead and provide political leverage, but you had to have a lot of other people going along. Here's the Central Work Conference that really determined that Deng would be the one to replace Hua Guofeng. And here they are, Chen Yun, about his same age, who would offer a somewhat different perspective and would deal with the economy, were chosen to be the two great leaders of that generation, with Deng having the role as spokesman. Just before that, Deng could see that modernization was coming, and the two countries that he needed to work with were Japan and the United States, because they could provide technology, they could provide industrial advice, management advice. And so he went to Tokyo, and here he is meeting Emperor Hirohito. In the 2,500 years of contact between China and Japan, it was the first time the Chinese leader had met Hirohito, and the Emperor of Japan. It was the first time in history. And Hirohito, in his own way, apologized for World War II and said we must never let those things happen again. And Deng accepted the policy. And that made it easier for both the Japanese and the Chinese to begin working together. Here Deng is visiting a steel factory that became the model for the Baoshan, the first great steel plant in China. Here he is riding on the Shinkansen, and when he was asked what it was like not wanting to fawn on the West, he said, "It's very fast." Here he is meeting Lee Kuan Yew, also just before his normalization with the United States. And, some of you are old enough to remember in my generation, there were a lot of people who thought that Chinese civilization, Confucianism, was not compatible with modernization, and didn't think that people of ethnic Chinese culture could really bring modernization. But here in Singapore was the example. Lee Kuan Yew, even though he was born in 1923, almost about 18 years after Deng was born, here was a country that was beginning with ethnic Chinese, 75% of the population. It had already moved ahead to modernization and done very well at it. Carter wanted to begin moving on the normalization when he came to power in '77, but he first was cautious because the Panama Canal treaties hadn't been done. In short, he sent Spig in May '78 to say we're beginning for serious discussions of modernization, and Deng and Spig immediately became great friends. Both shared the anti-Soviet sentiments, and both were ready to move toward normalization. Most of the negotiations for normalization were conducted by Chinese diplomats and American diplomats, but the final negotiations were between Leonard Woodcock and Deng, and here they are toasting the completion of those negotiations. As a result of those, Americans passed a message that a leader, a Chinese leader, would be welcome in the United States. Officially, Vogel was still chairman and premier, so they didn't want to say we invite Deng. But the message was passed from Woodcock to Deng that a Chinese leader would be welcome in the United States. And Deng said, how about next month? I'll be ready to come. When he got to the United States, here we have Herb Levin's friend and roommate at Harvard in 1948, right, Herb? Ji Chao-ju, who studied horseman in New York and Harvard for 3 years before he went back in the Korean War, came as interpreter, a wonderful, not only language interpreter, but cultural go-between. And as you can see, they're having a good time. When I interviewed Carter about Deng Xiaoping, he said, the visit of Deng was one of the best things about my administration. The 4 years, one of the most enjoyable events of the 4 years. Here they are waving from the White House. Here they are signing the normalization agreements. Deng said he wanted Nixon to be allowed to come to the White House, and that Nixon, in Chinese terms, had been purged because of Watergate. But Carter agreed, and that was the first time Nixon was allowed back in the White House after normalism. After he left the White House in Watergate. Here is Deng in the middle, a little guy, and Ji Chao-ju, that interpreter, standing next to him. Then there's a white-haired guy sitting down, Tip O'Neill, the House Speaker of the House. O'Neill regaled Deng about the relation between Congress and the White House, telling him all the clever things that Congress does to slow down the White House. And they became great friends. They had a great time. Deng invited him to go to China next year, and O'Neill accepted, and they had a great time. But when O'Neill finished this explanation of why it was important to have the legislature and the executive separate, Deng Xiaoping said it wouldn't work in China. He visited various places in the United States, such as Atlanta. And here he is in Texas at a rodeo. And a lady is riding up to him and giving him a hat. And Herb Levin, who seems to know the story better than I do, said that it hadn't been decided before that Deng would put on the hat. And a lot of Chinese diplomats didn't want him to put on the hat. But when Deng did, he immediately put on the hat. And we had this picture which became the great symbol for Deng in the United States. It was a symbol to the American people that this guy was human after all. Orville Schell, who's now at the Asia Society here, who was at this event and wrote about the reaction of Chinese who saw the movie with this picture, said it was as if all the years of yelling at American imperialism were suddenly over, and that was okay to start imbibing Western culture, Western ideas. In 1975, when Deng was in charge, it just happened that was the year at the liaison office in Beijing. The head of it was George Bush Sr. So they became great friends, and they had many discussions over the years. Here is Ronald Reagan. The amazing thing is that even though you have quite a few different American leaders, Carter and Bush and Reagan, they all seem to like Deng and feel very comfortable with him. Here, as you can see, Reagan's response was he didn't seem like a communist. Deng was, of course, the one who let Maggie Thatcher know that China would resume sovereignty in 1997 over Hong Kong. And some people said it was the match between the steel factory and the steel woman. But as you notice here, on the floor there's a spittoon, which characterized Deng's way of greeting foreigners. And some people say when you want to make an emphatic point, he used a spittoon more than usual. And on this particular occasion, he used it a lot. Here, a couple of years later, they reached agreement and they're happily greeting each other. Deng also wanted to get into international organizations, and he moved as quickly as he could to get in the World Bank, and here he is with Bob McNamara. Here he is with the head of IMF. I think many in this audience are old enough to remember the days before Google and Expedia. In those days, we got some of our world knowledge through the Encyclopedia Britannica. And Deng thought that was a quick way to learn about the outside of the world. And here he is working with Frank Gibney. They have the Encyclopedia Britannica into Chinese so they could open up completely and learn everything possible about the outside. In the summer of '78, Frank Press led a scientific delegation, and Deng was in such a hurry pressing Frank Press to get people into American universities as soon as we normalized relations that Frank Press felt he had to call Carter right away. Carter, when I interviewed Carter about this, he said he didn't have to wake me up at 3 in the morning. It was one of the few times he was wakened during the administration. And I think it showed the fervor that Deng had for getting students abroad and learning as much as you possibly could. When somebody in that delegation said, "What are you going to do if they don't want to come back?" He said, "It doesn't matter. They can still be helpful to China. We'll send as many as can go." He met a lot of other foreign business people and Chinese business people, and in the days before, the Dell and so forth, one of the computer companies that was big was Anwang, and he was learning about computers from Anwang. There he is in February '89 with Bush Sr. By the middle of 1988, already was looking as if Deng would be able to begin to get Soviet relations back on a better track. And he said that if the Soviets pulled their troops away from Mongolia, they pull out of Afghanistan, where they were way too bogged down, like some other countries have been since that time. And if the Vietnamese would pull out of Cambodia, we get Andy Murtha here who's working on some of those issues. If that happened, we would welcome the Soviet leaders. So Deng was so pleased with that the foreign leaders came to Beijing, and here they are welcoming Gorbachev to Beijing. Relations broke in 1963 when Deng went to Beijing, and when Deng went to Moscow, and now resumed in 1989 when he brought them to Beijing. And there were so many people who were wanted more freedoms, and there were so many foreigners who were sort of concerned and supporting the democracy, and there were so many Beijing citizens who were unhappy that their inflation had gone up so fast that their savings were rapidly being exhausted. The demonstrations were all over, and here we have the goddess of democracy. And Deng sent in on May 20th the troops, told them not to fire and to try to bring order, but they were stopped and they never were able to reach Tiananmen Square, and so Deng told them to pull back to the outskirts of Beijing, and then on June 3rd they were given orders to do what's necessary to restore order. He warned the people to stay off the streets, and the troops, as they moved in, first fired pellets and blanks into the air. But when they continued to resist the troops, they fired on the local people, and we all saw those things on television. This is a famous picture of the tanks moving in. President Bush Sr. said that because he knew personally Deng, and because he realized it was so hard to keep the relations had been so many decades when something went wrong, he was worried that even though he was applying sanctions and being very tough, that he wanted to send a personal representative to show that the relationship was still important. They wanted to understand that. And so Brent Scowcroft and Deng welcomed him. Deng was in a very grim mood, saying that China is in a very weak position. Things would have to be done by the United States to restore relations. But he said if the United States wants to do it, he's prepared to keep closer relations. And his basic response was China should not only remain open, but they should remain wide open. After that, Deng said we must stay calm. And this was a picture that was distributed widely at the time. So swimming in the wide ocean, the oceans which are not going to come and go, they'll still be there. And here is Deng spreading the word to the Chinese people and telling people that foreign businessmen within a few years will want to get back in China, and they will talk to their governments, encourage them to restore relations. And of course, he turned out to be right. 1992, Deng was finally ready to step down. Here he is stepping down at the 14th Party Congress. Here's his picture. I think it's a very poignant picture as he finishes and steps down off the stage. Here he is as an old man after he stepped down. Here in 1997, he passed away. Here is the scene of the memorial service for Deng. And here is Jiang Zemin giving the memorial speech. And here's the UN Security Council, where Deng made the maiden speech, where Deng made the maiden speech for China's entrance, observing a moment of silence on Deng's death. Thank you very much. We haven't given up on the idea of perhaps doing some chapters in Chinese, but I want to get it out exactly as I meant it first. It may be that people will duplicate the thing or have their own version or pirate. There are things that could happen that I don't have control over. But what I do have control over is making sure that one edition gets out exactly as I meant it in Chinese. And the Chinese Shoe Press says they will do it both in Fantizi for Taiwan and Hong Kong and in Jiantizi for the main. So the only trouble, I think, is that the book may become so high profile that the regime might have to respond in some way like that. Some of you may be able to predict better than I can. But I would be happy if we could get some chapters in China exactly as I meant it.
I think it's fair to conclude it won't be serialized in Renmin or Bao. It's not for a while.
But there are a number of journals and magazines that are coming to me, and can we do a chapter? Yeah, so...
But your view is it has to be published in whole, so no donations.
I'm willing to have some chapters published in Maine. I haven't given up. But I want the whole thing to be exactly as I meant it, and translated and available. So for those people who really want to know what I said, it is available. And I have enough confidence in the creativity of people who use computers that some people will find ways to get that.
You have this portrayal of Deng, which many don't really, or didn't really see, which is of a real family man. Somebody who really spent time with his wife and his children, in the latter years, grandchildren. And then, of course, you talk about during the Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping, I think you say falling out of the window. And
I think jumped is my best guess.
Yeah, jumped, or in any case, but wasn't given proper medical care, and then became paraplegic. But you don't really talk about how that affected Deng's view of kind of politics, of stability, of kind of how he should deal with even June 4th.
I see my role as a biographer, as a historian, with the hope that my book will be used by others, of not imputing ideas to them that I can't show. And what I try as much as possible is say, this is what other people thought, or this is what he did, and trying to present it in such a way that the reader comes to more or less the same perspective that I do, without saying he did it. And there's so many things about Deng where we don't have the smoking gun. I mean, he had learned as a youth in the underground to keep things quiet. and in the Cultural Revolution, they couldn't find papers on him because he hadn't written any papers. He didn't leave anything around. So it makes the task of biographer more difficult. You have to triangulate. And my hope is that this, by presenting as much facts and circumstances, that this book will have some lasting value, instead of just saying this is what Deng thought when I don't really know.
You know, you have these great descriptions of Deng, kind of, well, first his rehabilitations, and then his kind of these reversals of verdicts. And as I read through those, I couldn't but be thinking of the irony of June 4th. And, you know, Deng presided over these reversals of verdict. And will there be that kind of reversal of verdict after those who were responsible have passed from the scene?
Well, the way I see it is that way back in the 20s and 30s, there are constant do's and fro's. And some people whose verdicts were reversed were again, reversed again, and back and forth. Deng was purged 3 times. Other people fell and then came back and then purged others. So it may be ironic, but I don't think it's rare. I think in fact, once Deng came to power in '78 and reversed a lot of the earlier verdicts, there weren't many cases where people in large numbers were criticized and sent out and punished in the same way they had been in the earlier years. So I think that the task of reversals became lessened after Deng's power, and while they may reverse that, 1989, within some time period, perhaps when some of the principles are no longer around. I don't think that's unusual in the history of the revolutionary movement.
But ironic in the sense that he presided over those reversals, and then probably the most damaging part of his legacy will likely have I would say will likely have a reversal of verdict. I think you point out in the book quite correctly, it's already occurring.
Yeah.
That the descriptions of the events have actually been ratcheted down, modified.
And a lot of the people who were arrested were later released or their sentences reduced. So it's already been the seriousness of the crimes of June 4th as treated by Deng and others has been reduced.
The great description of the kind of the Deng Xiaoping policy in Tibet in the book, which again most people don't focus on the fact that it was a very different policy from today. Can you look forward and think, is there a time when we'll see the leadership, which clearly does not agree with the Deng Xiaoping policy, especially given Hu Jintao was the party secretary of Tibet, will be a time when we'll see a movement back to that kind of policy?
The people I talked to felt that Deng could no longer trust the Dalai Lama. I mean, this is from the Chinese point of view, the Chinese government and party point of view, that he wants a greater Tibet that they could not possibly tolerate. And he wants a level of freedom that the communist regime is not prepared to tolerate. And it's hard for me to see that while the Dalai Lama is in charge, it's hard for me to be optimistic that they will resolve that. But I could imagine, say 10, 15, 20 years from now, that they could begin to try a softer approach to Tibet again. I think what they're trying right now is use money into Tibet and also co-opt talented young people to allow people to able Tibetans a chance to earn money and to learn English and go to institutions that learn Mandarin. Some of the learning is, but mainly Mandarin, and therefore become part of Chinese culture. And one of the Chinese leaders told me, he said, well, what happened to the American Indians? We're not going to do anything that bad. But, greater civilizations have a way of absorbing as they advance more rapidly than some of the less advanced peoples. That's their perspective.
I have a good dozen questions left. Let me ask just my final question, and open it to the floor for questions, which is, again, a great description on the end of Deng's career, this southern tour.
Yeah.
And he goes on this extraordinary trip to kind of reinvigorate reform. And he gives these speeches, and they're not covered. The media, the propaganda department decides this is not our policy. So Jiang Zemin is already party secretary, but the propaganda department is making the decision, don't do this. Now, my question actually is, we have seen similar situations in the last 12 months with the premier of China making a speech on the 30th anniversary of the creation of the Shenzhen SEZ and getting no coverage from Beijing media. Is this going to change? Is the party going to... Is this kind of the tip of the iceberg where we see the continuing conflict within the party, and this is the way it gets resolved?
Others have focused on the current period much more deeply than I have. I mean, all of my juices to work on Deng's period. But my sense is that Deng had far more power and authority, even though he was officially out of power, than Wen Jiabao does now. And I think it's a very different era when you had revolutionary heroes who had fought the enemy in World War II, fought in the Civil War, and who established the regime. It's a very different era than those who grew up within the organization and are well-behaved and have served their way on up, but don't have the revolutionary depth and background and authority. So I could imagine there being more open display of different views, but I doubt whether anybody can easily have the authority that Deng was able to muster to counter the General Secretary of the party, Jiang Zemin.
A historian's answer.
I'm becoming a historian by just living so long.
Let me open the floor to questions, and if somebody want to come up and grab this microphone, I think that we're going to use. That's right here. I think that's the question microphone. So we'll start here.
Hi, thank you. Deng worked so hard for the repatriation of Hong Kong to the mainland. He passed just before the handover. What were his last words, and does anybody know, and did they have anything to do with Hong Kong or Taiwan or...
Before he died in 1997?
Yes.
I haven't been able to find good records of what he did after he sat down at the end of 92. There are just a few entrances in the input, the chronology, and I'm not sure. I really don't know the answer to that question. There may be some evidence, but I don't recall right at the moment. Sorry.
Well, you've tried, certainly.
I did.
Thank you.
Did your researchers allow you a direct perspective onto more or less precisely how many people were actually killed in Tiananmen Square?
I've looked at different estimates, and I don't have any way of making a serious independent estimate. Some of the original estimates of reporters, I think, were exaggerated. They put in many thousands. To me, the regime plays, I think the figure is around 300, and that's their official figure. To me, the most credible account, I think, is the one that Tim Brooke put together. This is a Canadian scholar who was in Beijing at the time and talked to a lot of military attaches and to the hospitals, went around to the hospitals, and his estimate is somewhere in the order of 700 to 800 million. So I had 7 million people, 7 to 800 700 to 800 people. So I think you have a range. Official estimates about 300 to 300. You have Tim Brooks was around 700-800. I think the estimates is 20,000 to 30,000. Nobody takes those seriously anymore. That the highest estimates I think that are within reason are a little over 2,000. So it's that I try to present that range, which is the best I can do from the data that's available.
Hi.
Supposedly it's on.
In any case, you talked just a moment ago about Deng's revolutionary depth and his background, which makes him different than some contemporary leaders. Could you talk a little bit more about his communism? And you talked a little bit about how he was young, but for me, it doesn't gel how someone goes from being someone who's interested in China becoming a great power again and turning around and being a revolutionary and so on. So if you could talk just a little bit more about that.
I think that at the time of 1919, when Deng's sort of adult mentality was just being formed, and he was demonstrating on the streets of Guangdong County where he lived, these were people who felt China was so weak. It was being taken advantage of by the world powers per se. And they wanted to make China stronger. And they wanted to build up a base that would be able to make it stronger. And I think the picture that I showed of the young communists in France, 1924, they thought of themselves as a vanguard. And they didn't look like workers and peasants. But they would lead and use large masses of people to build a strong organization. I think that's what they meant by revolution. I think what Mao meant was keep stirring up the masses. And I think where the key difference between Mao and Deng probably occurred in around 1959 was that Mao wanted to keep pushing for stirring up the masses. Mao was in a way away from the front line. Deng was the administrator, the one who was responsible for making things happen. And he wanted a crisp organization. He was 12 years a military leader in wartime. And he wanted discipline. And he believed very strongly that the organization needed discipline. And he felt that Mao constantly stirring up the masses, and particularly in the Cultural Revolution, was just going to pull the country apart. So, on the other hand, I disagree with those who say that Deng simply wanted to introduce capitalism. I think that, after all, the land is still owned by the state. It's not owned you don't have individual property. You have state firms that are on a much bigger scale than they are in most Western capitalist countries. I think he also did not want the bourgeois class to have an influence in shaping policy. He wanted the Communist Party high leaders to be insulated and not to be subject to control by people who would pay for their way to influence. And so I think in all those, it's different from what we mean by capitalism. You may choose a different word, but I think that those who simply said Deng wanted capitalism under some other name, that's not the conclusion I come to. Yeah.
It might be.
If it doesn't work, just speak loudly.
Just a quick question, maybe not a quick answer. One of the verdicts that Deng did not reverse was the anti-rightist label. And since he was the person put in charge of that campaign, it was unclear to me kind of how that played out, say in the 90s. So on the one hand, I would meet people in China who were still going out to the countryside to help with the harvest because they'd been branded rightists back in 57, 58. On the other hand, Zhu Rongji himself was erased. And so I'm just curious, what people were saying at the time was, well, this is something that will be reversed after Deng dies, but it seems to me that there was something a little more complicated and nuanced going on.
What Deng said is later on, as you say, he was very central in leading the movement of the anti-rightist campaign and was right at the forefront in punishing the intellectuals at that time. But when he came back in '75, he had Hu Yaobang do a great deal to ease and improve the situation of intellectuals. And I think he felt at that time it's too early to reverse the verdicts in a formal way, but they wanted to improve the life of a lot of people who had suffered in the anti-rightist campaign. And then later, after he came to power in 1978, what he said is, it had been expanded way too much. It had covered far too large of a territory. And he never said that the anti-rightist campaign was completely wrong. But there were only a handful of people who were left that he still did not free. I mean, out of the 550,000 roughly who were alive who had been rightists, virtually all of them were freed and forgiven. But my hunch is, and this is only a hunch because I don't have the smoking gun, that he felt that the state and government needs a authority, and if you too quickly easily say that we're all wrong, or that no matter what people said in criticism of the government, they can get away with it, I think that would be too much for him. As I look, consistent with his behavior, whenever it got pretty wide, he wanted to maintain the authority of the party and the government to crack down and place limits. And so my hunch is that he wanted to keep that principle, even though nearly everybody who had been accused of being anti-rightist would have their problems reversed, had their conclusions reversed.
Let me not be accused of being a leftist and go over to the right side.
Would you speculate? What do you think Deng would think if you were alive right now, looking at modern China?
I have thought about that. When you live with them as I have for 10 years, try to think how he thought about everything. I think if he were alive right now, first of all, he would be terribly happy that the standard of living has risen so much. He had wanted so much to make China richer and more powerful. And I think he would be pleased that the dreams that he was acting on of making China richer and stronger had been put on the right path. I think that part he would feel very happy with. I think he would feel that the corruption has gotten too serious, and that's a worrisome problem that had gotten out of hand. And in one speech near the end of his career, he said, you got to grab things with both fists. One fist, you got to keep pushing reform and opening, and the other, you got to crack down, he said, illegal behavior, but he meant things like corruption, where people were very upset. I think in 1978, after he came to power, he believed that so many cadre had been punished during the Cultural Revolution, they were immobilized. And when he felt he wanted to get people to doing things, and he kept saying he wanted cadres who who dared to do things. That's what he wanted. And in order to get people to do that, he couldn't punish them for every little thing. If he did that, they'd be afraid. And so he was, as long as you could make economic progress in your local area, he was ready to overlook quite a bit. And I think now, if he were alive now, he would say it's gone too far, and you got to crack down. And I think, given his personal authority, he would be able to crack down. Another thing, Deng in his early part of his life said some will get rich first. That meant that at a certain point, those who got rich should be helping other areas. And I think perhaps even before the current leadership moved to help the others, Deng would feel that's now the time. And that he had been a leader at the time when the coastal areas had been allowed to get rich, and now was the time you got to push, and he might even push even further in moving to the inland. So I think those, and also he would have been putting down the military who were creating problems in the South China Sea with their neighbors. He felt that he kept saying about Dachi, the big circumstance, the overall, was important to have peace. In order to keep improving the lives of Chinese, they had to have peaceful relations with the outside. The Soviet Union made a bad mistake by getting so many enemies and overspending on military that they weren't able to help develop and strengthen their own country. And that he, having more authority over the military than the current leaders do, I think he would have clamped down on those military leaders more quickly, and he would be promoting more military to military discussions with the outside.
And what would he think of the current leadership?
They don't have enough verve they ought to be tougher, and they ought to be bolder in the way they're doing things. They're well behaved. This is a gut feeling that they were behaving too much like bureaucrats and not enough like real political leaders. My hunch is that's the way he would feel.
We have unfortunately, we have come to the end of our time, and I can tell you that what you have heard is a flavor of what you will see in the book, read in the book. In fact, what you just heard is very similar to the last paragraph.
I apologize for those who've already read the book.
No, but it's great because it's a view of China that we really often don't get. It's the textured view. It's the view that's based on triangulation, as you put it. But that you can get the book outside, and Ezra will be around for the next few minutes to sign your copies. So please feel free to buy the book at our discounted price. And but thank Ezra for doing this.